So here's our game grid component. Now this component is involved in making HTTP requests. Currently it knows the type of request we're going to send. It knows about our endpoint. And in the future, it should also know about canceling requests using the abort controller. This is something we don't want in our components because our components should be primarily responsible for returning markup and handling user interactions at a high level. Now here we have two options. One way is to move this logic, the logic for making HTTP requests, inside a service as we did in the previous section. The other option is to move the entire logic, meaning the state variables and the effect, inside a hook. So hooks are not necessarily for sharing functionality across different components. We can also use them to separate concerns and make our code more modular and reusable. So let's create a custom hook for fetching the games. So back to our project. Here in the source folder, we add a new folder called hooks. Now in this folder, we add a new file called usegames.ts. Now here we define a function, usegames. And before we forget, we export it from this module, usegames. Now we're going to our game grid and grab the entire code and move it into our custom hook. Let's resolve the compilation errors. So first we need to import the state hook. Next, we need to bring the game interface. Now I'm going to move the game interface into this file because this is where we have the main functionality around fetching the games. So back to our component, we're going to move these two interfaces into this new module. Okay, now we still have a couple more arrows. Let's import the effect hook and the API client. Good. Now in this hook or in this function, we should return the games and error objects so we can use them in our component. So after we call the effect hook, we return an object with two properties, games and error. Now we can also add the loading state. We'll come back and implement it later in the course. Now back to our component. First, let's clean up some code. So on the top, we don't need these two import statements. So let's remove them. Good. Now in this component, we simply call useGames. We get an object. We destructure it to grab the games and the error. As simple as that. Now our component is a lot cleaner. It doesn't know anything about making HTTP requests. It's primarily responsible for returning some markup. Now let's test our application. So back in the browser, we get a request with the status of 404 because I messed up with the endpoint. So back to our hook, let's change xgames to games. And now here are the games. Beautiful. I just realized that I made a mistake earlier. So I forgot to include an array of dependencies in the effect hook. Without this, we constantly send requests to our backend, something we never want to happen. So we add this here. Now we should also handle the cancellations. So in this effect, we create a controller object. We set it to an instance of abort controller. Now, when making this get request, we pass an object as a second argument and set the signal property to controller.signal. And finally, we need to return the cleanup function. So after we call API client.get, inside this effect, we return a cleanup function. And here we simply call controller.abort. Let's see if this is working. So back in the browser, we have an error message on the top saying canceled because we didn't check for canceled requests. So back to our catch callback, here we add a block of code. First, we check if error is an instance of canceled error, we return. Otherwise, we set the error to error.message. With that, if we refresh, the canceled error goes away and we see the list of games. Now let's bring up Chrome DevTools. Here in the network tab, let's refresh the page. We have two requests, but the first one is canceled because React unmounted our component and remounted it as part of the strict mode. So we're done with this step, and now it's time to commit our code. So here I'm going to say create a custom hook to fetch the games.